All right, David. Well, in sports, they sometimes say it's over. And yes, the NHL trade deadline is finally come and gone. A lot of trades happened on NHL trade deadline day. And let's jump right in it. Let's get to you. You're the guy, you're the expert. What did you make of the NHL trade deadline?
Little lackluster, certainly. We didn't see the big sexy trades happen because they all happened in the days leading up to the deadline. So today, a little bit of a womp kind of day, but still some impactful moves. A lot of teams really solidifying depth and making those types of moves. We saw Buffalo get into a plan or make a move that fits their long-term plan and bringing up Greenway from Minnesota. Obviously, Klingberg was a big one as well for the Wild. But really, this is kind of what we anticipated, that all because of all the big moves that happened already, uh, we're sitting here with likely depth moves. I had it around 12 to 15. We end up at 19, so I guess the over is pretty good.
You mentioned two names there, and obviously Greenway and Klingberg. And let's touch a little bit more on Klingberg and that move to Minnesota.
Yeah, there were a few teams that were in on him. It really was coming down to what was the price, and everybody was really starting to haggle the Anaheim Ducks and trying to get John Klingberg out of there. There were a few teams that were part of this. Seattle was definitely in that mix. We heard rumblings of Tampa Bay and a few others, but the dollars, I mean, that really played a big factor here. So he's making $7 million. The Ducks are eating half of that. Some teams needed more retention with a third party. It made it almost impossible on deadline day to consummate something in the hours leading up to 3 o'clock Eastern. So, Minnesota is a team that they wanted to add, but they wanted to add expiring deals and try to go on a bit of a run here because they think the West is wide open. They get an ad and address a need on the blue line. There were a few other teams, like I mentioned, but Minnesota comes out on top here.
What happened or what didn't happen with James Van Riemsdyk in Philadelphia?
Yeah, this is a head scratcher because, I mean, everybody, we reported it. I think everybody else had reported it, that there was something in place with Detroit, but it needed a third party. They needed to move out some money, or at least that's what they wanted to, or what was being relayed to Philly anyway, and then I guess to us. But it didn't happen. So at the last minute, they just basically pulled. Now, Chuck Fletcher said there was nothing really there. He tried to explain it, and then, I mean, unfortunately for him, for JVR, that is, he stays in Philly because they wanted to get him, and he wanted to go to a contender. Seattle, Vegas, Colorado were three teams that were in the mix. Now, again, Seattle and even Vegas, cap issues. So you needed to get a third party in there. And maybe Detroit was actually being used as the third party, and they couldn't get things dealt with either Vegas or Seattle. So perhaps that's something that may have come into play here because Detroit has a ton of cap space. So this was an interesting one, but ultimately he gets a little bit disappointed and he's sticking around in Philly. I mean, he likes it there,
Yeah.
obviously, but he wanted to chase a cup. It's unfortunate.
How much smoke was there around Radko Gudas?
There was a lot. There was a lot of interest in Radko Gudas, but I mean, Florida for the last few days they've been juggling. Up until a couple days ago, they weren't selling, and then in the I guess day before the deadline, they started to consider some options, or at least start entertaining calls. Now there was a lot of interest, as I said, in Radko Gudas, who's a pending unrestricted free agent. He's got $2.5 million cap hit, brings a lot of different intangibles to the mix. Florida ultimately decides to hang on to him. He wasn't the only one, though, Irf, that was getting phone calls, that the Panthers were getting phone calls on. Sam Reinhart, with 1 year left on his contract, there were a lot of teams, or a few teams, rather, I should say, that had serious interest. Now, Florida wasn't actively shopping him. They were willing to listen. They did that. Obviously, they didn't pull the trigger on anything because they ultimately felt they wanted to stick around into this playoff run. We'll see what happens in the offseason with respect to him and Sam Bennett.
I know Jakob Chychrun has a new home in Ottawa, but there might have been another team that had some interest in him.
There were a few, certainly, and as we learned that one after another, they wouldn't wait anymore and they just fell out. But what we can tell you is that there was an offer on the table. We reported this earlier on in the week, I think last week as well, that there was a long-standing offer on the table. I was told it was a very lucrative offer. It included 2 first-round picks and a prospect, a kid that was drafted in the first round. Now, there was some talk. It could have been Alex Turcotte, could have been Rasmus Kupari. It turned out that it was Tobias Bjornfoot. So a Bjornfoot package with 2 additional first-round picks was on the table, I believe, for about 2 weeks. And Arizona was looking to see if they could top that somewhere else. Waited too long. Didn't end up happening, obviously. LA basically gave Arizona up until midweek this week, which turned out to be Tuesday, before getting an answer. Didn't happen. They pivoted. They went to Gavrikov, and every other team basically followed suit. So they end up with a first and 2 seconds for Chychrun. Not bad. Not nearly what they wanted.
All right, David, final one for us. We mentioned head scratchers and teams, kind of what were they thinking and what was going on. And I think you and I and a lot of people around the National Hockey League can all agree the Vancouver Canucks were one of those teams.
Yeah, big time. I'm still trying to wrap my head around everything that was going on. What I can tell you, and I'd like you to chime in on this as well, because you're as well connected in Vancouver as pretty much anybody. They're all the JT Miller reports, and they're accurate. I mean, Pittsburgh did talk to Vancouver about JT Miller. Patrick Allvin earlier today, after the deadline, saying he never had an offer on the table. Semantics. You talked about certain pieces, but I do know for a fact that Brock Boeser was also discussed as a piece going from Vancouver to Pittsburgh. Without question, that had been discussed. That conversation had been going on for a while. Eventually pivoted to JT Miller, and it never happened. Both of them never happened. So were Pittsburgh and Vancouver involved in talks? Yeah, 100%. It had different options in play, Irf. But I'm curious as to your take. It's your backyard. What's going on over there?
Well, I think we can start with the whole Pittsburgh Vancouver thing, and that didn't just start this week. I think
Right.
it's been a couple weeks. Obviously, if and when it all does come out, and one of the GMs does end up saying something in the summer about what happens, or if we figure out of the draft, it's going to be an interesting tale for us all to hear. But I do agree with you. Brock Boeser's name was on the table. JT Miller's name was on the table. Yes, Patrick Allvin said there was no offer put towards him, and yeah, he's probably right. There wasn't an offer, but they were discussed. And I think that's what got people excited. I think that's what we reported, because there was definitely something brewing. Now, who balked? We don't really know. It could have been the Pittsburgh Penguins and Ron Hextall, or it could have been the Vancouver Canucks and Patrick Allvin. I guess we'll never know, but we can tell you that there's definitely something that was in the air there. Now, is it something that can be revisited in the summer at the draft? Maybe. I think the Canucks now don't really have a pressure point. It would be July 1st for JT Miller's contract, and obviously Brock Boeser only has 2 years left now on his deal, but we'll see what happens there.
Yeah, very curious to see how not only that, but some things even in Philadelphia. Kevin Hayes and Ivan Provorov were discussed. I think there was some progress on Hayes' front. I think that, along with Vancouver's situation with Miller and Boeser, I think those types of discussions are going to continue in the offseason. I'll even throw Colton Parayko in there with St. Louis. The Blues want to augment their defense. He's a guy who wasn't approached about waiving his no trade, but I think those are the type of storylines we're going to hear in the summer as we get close to the draft in Nashville, which should be a decent time.
David, thank you very much for this. Once again, the NHL trade deadline is over as we now enter the stretch drive of the NHL season, heading towards April and the playoffs, which should be fun. The West, according to everyone, is wide open, and the East is absolutely stacked. Looking forward to it, David.